Hi, I'm Eric Ford for Made Here. Director Ian Sweet from Wastefield, Vermont is back with another look at the fantastic local beverage industry with Ciderology, Vermont Hard Pressed. You may have seen his other Made Here films focused on the Vermont IPA and Vermont distilleries. This time, Ian looks at the history of hard cider in Vermont, the evolution, the current industry, and the future. You can watch Ciderology and many other Made Here stories about the region streaming on vermontpbs.org and through the PBS app. Enjoy the film, and thanks for watching.
Gave us knowledge and the apple brought peace, illuminated gravity while Newton lay sleeping. But most of all, come the harvest, come the fall, the world gets a little brighter. Hard, hard cider, easy living, drinking apple a day keeps the doctor away, keeps your tick-tock ticker ticking. The apple in the garden wasn't meant for eating, but if they'd had more time, Adam and Eve could have turned it into cider. Let the cider ferment, raise a toast to the host, adios and amen. Hard, hard cider, easy living, drinking apple a day keeps the doctor away, keeps the tick-tock ticker ticking, keeps the tick-tock ticker ticking, keeps the tick-tock ticker ticking. Hard, hard cider, easy living, drinking apple a day keeps the doctor away, keeps the tick-tock ticker ticking, keeps the tick-tock ticker ticking, keeps the tick-tock ticker ticking.
The history of cider is different than beer or spirits because it was right from the get-go an important food source. You didn't drink the water in colonial times and earlier due to the nature of different bacteria and issues in the cleanliness of the water. And cider was always a guaranteed safe beverage, even if it slightly turned. There was nothing toxic to it that ever was a main issue. You know, apples and hard cider just become second nature. You know, in New England, one of the biggest prized apples was the Baldwin apple that originated in Massachusetts, I think about 1720s, thereabouts. And it was a unique apple that was discovered and became one of the most prized to make cider. Cider itself, both historically and in the present, is not necessarily one single varietal of apples, although there are very good historical varieties that were kind of an all-in-one apple, where you had the aspects of sweetness, acidity, and tannins. Kingston Black was one of the other prized apples that was highly desired because it did have all the aspects rather than having to blend. But Baldwin apple was one of the more prized, and the Roxbury Russet was another varietal. And these apples were all across New England, so it was kind of a food source right from the get-go. And references in New England start off early. Samuel Sewall, who was Salem, best known as the Salem witch judge for the witch trials, kept a very detailed diary of his travels. And you have to understand that in the late 1600s, the courtrooms were actually cleared out taverns and other places. And so in his writings, there was documents where he kind of had a disdain for some of the ales and hard spirits, but cider was considered more of just the everyday beverage. By the 1770s, cider is everywhere across New England and New York and further south, and was a prized commodity. Once again, it was stuff that kept you going through the winter. It was part hydration, part calories, and also had nutrients in it, which were very valued. We get to a point in Vermont that right at 1790, where the first brewery in Middlebury is kind of starting to launch, you already see widespread cider documents. One reference that I've always loved, it was in the Cabot area of Vermont, that it talked about how the average family of 4 was going to put down between 30 and 40 barrels of cider in the basement to get through the winter. And you also had references in early Vermont journals and papers about how you kept your best barrel or 2 of hard cider set aside for when the local priest would be coming to visit the home. And the apple season in Vermont is, depending if it's an early or late season apple, it could be the middle of August all the way through the end of October. And even so, one of the things that did occur in Vermont, that there are some references I found over the years, is letting the frozen apples be the last of the harvest, where they would harvest the frozen apples and run them through the press where they've kind of dried and shriveled up, making a more concentrated hard cider, or an ice cider as it's sometimes referred to. And cider is really everywhere and nowhere at all in Vermont in the 19th century. We have the onset of Prohibition on a local level in the 1820s and 30s. Once Prohibition came in, there was a massive decline in the orchards. In Vermont specifically, you have cases where orchards were cut down by the 1890s and early 1900s just to stop cider production altogether, and a lot of changeover to different crops. And once we go through federal prohibition, which is 1918 to 1932, it's really a lost art of cider production. Prohibition took away all that interest, and apples returned to this wholesome food rather than being crushed, pressed, and fermented into a beverage. We basically don't have hard cider on a commercial level in Vermont until after craft breweries are already open. And we have in 1991, the Woodchuck's hard cider was first produced, I believe it was Proctorsville, where it first started as a side project of a winery, and it gained traction. Hard cider was a much more difficult sell in not only Vermont but New England. And Woodchuck ultimately, through different iterations, is now this very large facility in Middlebury, Vermont.
Cider making is an old and a wonderful trade. It goes back thousands of years, really, and the process is quite simple. You need juice, apple juice, and you need yeast to ferment the sugars in the juice into alcohol. And it can happen all by itself using wild yeast that grow naturally in nature. So you can At home, if you have an apple tree, you can squash up your apples and put them in a bucket and wait 2 or 3 weeks, and slowly over time that turns to hard cider. The danger with that is that you're not controlling the fermentation. You may try to taste it afterwards and it tastes really funny. So there can be a lot of things that can go wrong with that basic natural process. So a cider maker's job is to take that same juice that you start with and try to tailor or control the fermentation to get a consistent and a desired, outcome every time.
Woodchuck started back in 1991. It was a small little cidery down in Proctorsville, Vermont, originally called Joseph Cerniglier Winery. They had a wine company. They started seeing ciders from Europe come into the US, and they thought they could make one that would work for the American palate. And so in 1991, they launched Woodchuck Amber, and that has grown to what it is today. We still have that same Woodchuck Amber on the shelves across the US. And throughout time, we just kept adding different styles to relate to the consumer's palates. The brand grew. We started to see tourists coming into the ski slopes down in southern Vermont. They were taking it home with them. So we started reaching outside of Vermont and growing that way. The company grew too big. In 91 when it started, it was in a 2-car garage, very small, on a 10-ounce soda filler, and we'd fill the last 2 ounces of every bottle by hand. And so it really outgrew that fast. So in 96 we moved to Springfield, Vermont, and grew there. And we had some other investors that came in and out of it. Stroh's Brewing was part of it, and when it moved to 96, they were investment in it. And then in 98, Bulmers from England became part of it, and they had an investment in it. And in 2000, we outgrew Springfield, moved to Middlebury, Vermont, just down the road from where we are today. And we were at that cidery from 2000 till 2014 when we opened this one.
It's our first cidery that we built dedicated to the Woodchuck brand. You heard some stories about how we grew from the first 2-car garage to the first rented space in a brewery to a leased space here in Middlebury. But fortunately, about 6 years ago now, we decided we needed a home of our own. And they decided to develop this greenfield site here in Middlebury. It was our hometown, and we wanted a cidery that could really produce woodchuck the way we wanted it to be produced.
Back in the early 90s, the American palate was definitely a sweeter palate than it was in Europe, so a lot of the European ciders were much drier, where the American palate was used to the apple juice and different sodas and juices that were out on the market. And so when we created Woodchuck Amber, it was a sweeter profile. Over time, certainly ciders have dried out. Still, usually in the US, it's still sweeter than European ciders, but they range greatly now, from sweet to dry to fruity, which you just didn't see early on.
Cider is its own thing. It's made more like wine, and it's packaged more like beer. So we couldn't just roll into a winery and have it suit our needs, nor could we just go into another brewery and have it suit our needs. Cider is fermented like a wine, specifically like a white wine. Instead of grape juice, we're using apple juice to make our base cider or an apple wine. And that requires long, cool fermentations. So all of our tanks are temperature-controlled stainless steel tanks, and they're designed to keep that cider at a comfortable room temperature. The yeast during fermentation don't want to be too cold, they'll stall out, and they don't want to be too hot, or else they can die and produce some off flavors. So you want to keep the yeast nice and comfortable at a cool fermentation. For us, that's around room temperature of 65 to 70 degrees. So that's how the fermenters and the cider tanks are designed. After that, cider is different. Whereas in the wine world, you would maybe hold on to your wine for 9 months up to 2 years before you released it for an aging and settling process. Cider is ready to be drunk soon after it is produced. So we want to turn around those tanks more frequently. So when we walk around and look at the cellar, you can see a lot of extra smaller stainless steel tanks for the blending and holding process. Once the fermentation is complete, we move the cider over to a base holding tank, and it doesn't need to age or settle out over time like a wine. What we do is filter it, and then we can blend it with whatever ingredients we are adding to the cider for whatever style or flavored cider it's going. After the cellar side, there's the production side, And we're not producing cider in large wine bottles like a winery. It's more packaged like beer. So we're going into the traditional beer packages, single serving cans or bottles, and also into kegs. So our production facility may look like a brewery that you've been to and toured, where we're putting cider into single serve packaging because that's what the customers want. They want to be able to buy a 6-pack or a 12-pack of cider and enjoy it during all those occasions that they would normally be drinking a beer. Our bottling line moves at about 600 bottles a minute, and it takes 10 hours to produce those 10,000 cases. Our can line is relatively newer, and it produces 100 cans a minute, so it takes 10 hours to produce 2,000 cases. So this cidery is sized for a mid-sized beverage company. Compared to a lot of small startups or orchard operations, they may look at us and think we're quite huge, but on the scale of things, we're bigger than a lot of small beverage companies, but smaller than the really big guys. So the Woodchuck Amber that we're making today is the same recipe that we started with 30 years ago. So it's very close and hasn't changed very much over time. What has changed is the number of ciders we make. Whereas amber used to be 80–90% of the cider we sold initially, now it's less than half of what we make is amber, and we make 10 or 15 other styles that are common in rotation under the Woodchuck label. The quality control comes with consistency, and that has to do with sourcing a particular mix of apples and fermenting them in a similar way. For amber, it's a fresh, sweet apple cider, so we're using the American varieties, the table varieties of apples for that cider. Red Delicious, McIntosh, Granny Smith, Gala, the things that are readily available in most orchards in the U.S. That becomes the base cider for something like amber. The fermentation is what makes it consistent, batch after batch, and the final blending and packaging is what makes it taste the same now as it did 5 years ago.
At the end of the day, Woodchuck still is the Vermont company. It started here, and this is where our heart is, this is where our focus is. And it's exciting that we have this cidery here to help out us and the industry.
Our primary supplier for local apple juice is with Sunrise Orchards. They're right down the road in Cornwall, and they're one of the larger orchardists in the state, one of the larger orchards in the state. And so we've worked with them over a number of years on trying to see if cider makers and orchardists can work together to, get more apples, more cider apples grown here in the state to meet the demand of the cideries in Vermont, so that we can buy more and more of our apples within the state and not having to rely on juice from the Northeast or farther away places.
Well, our family weren't dairy farmers. I'm the 3rd generation apple farmer in our family. My father is from Virginia. My mother was from Connecticut, and they met in New York City in the 60s. And my dad was always sort of planning on going in the apple business like his father in Virginia, but my mom was a New Englander through and through. So they landed in Vermont, purchased a dairy farm that was on its way out, and converted it to apples. So they were never intending to be dairy farmers, only apples. So our farm has been a wholesale farm since its conception in 1974. And we've packed apples. We grow, pack, store, and ship, not in that order. And so we've always had a need for an outlet for lower grade fruit other than the fresh, sweet eating apple varieties. We have a keen focus to quality regardless of whether it's a cider apple or a fresh eating apple. And over the years, our relationships with cideries has always been very strong. And by cideries, originally that was for sweet cider. Companies buying apples to make sweet drinking cider, not hard cider. And around 2012, 2013, there was a real shift in demand for Vermont apples to supply hard cider companies. And fortunately, Middlebury has an established cidery in Woodchuck hard cider, has been here for a long time, and our relationship with them has grown and built. A vast majority of our harvest workers, the people who pick the apples, are from Jamaica. They've been coming to Sunrise Orchards. I think our gentleman who's been coming the longest has been here since 1985. There's probably 4 or 5 of them, of the guys. Right now we have 18 workers here, and all of them have been coming here a minimum of 10 years. So we get repeat workers every year. We request those names to come up from Jamaica through the H2A program. And we couldn't be a wholesale apple farm without those workers. They contribute to the economy. They spend their money here and take some home, and we are grateful that they are willing to travel so far for a relatively short window of time. The hard cider industry is very competitive, and ultimately the cost of supply, in my experience in the last, as the industry has sort of settled in, the cost of supply becomes the most critical thing for them in terms of production. And it's been interesting to see if we can produce higher quality fruit for them, which would mean better yield, better flavor profiles, yield from a bushel of apples, for example, how much cider for a bushel of apples, that those things could carry over into perhaps a higher value for us. And we've had some success there. But I think ultimately the downward pressure for these companies to be competitive may cause the bump in price that definitely happened over the last 5 years in cider apple value to wane, if you will. So I'm not sure it can sustain what we've been getting. We've been getting some of the highest prices for cider apples as a result of great relationships with folks, and that's helped our business a lot. Hopefully it can continue.
So the apple program, or the fruit program, because we also do some work with grapes, conducts research. So we conduct a number of different research projects, usually, almost always, grower driven. So a grower comes to me with a question, we write up a grant, we try to answer the question. So we do applied research, we do teaching, so we teach a viticulture, a grape production, and an orchard management class here at the farm. And we provide outreach. So I provide the outreach to the grower community in Vermont and the surrounding region when they've got questions, mostly about pest management, crop management, as well as a little bit on cider management. Vermont is a perfect place to grow apples, although apples are not native here. People don't always realize that. They see what they call wild apples. Our apples are actually feral, means that they were brought and then kind of released into the wild. But we have the perfect climate for them. We have the perfect conditions in terms of moisture and soil type. They're a very adaptable tree, but because we're in this moist, especially, a fairly humid area with rainfall, and it's cold but not ridiculously cold, we have certain challenges that there might be less of in other parts of the country. So some of the biggest issues we have in Vermont are disease problems because of the moisture and fungal diseases. We have a whole host of insects that all want to eat your apples, and that makes it more difficult to grow apples here than on the West Coast, or on the dry side of the West Coast, I should say inside the mountains, where it's high desert. As long as you can bring water to the fruit, you don't have the pests, you don't have the humidity. So we have challenges, even though these trees really want to grow here. You look around the roadsides, there's trees everywhere, but when you look closer, they're not always the highest quality fruit. So part of my job and a grower's job is to try to navigate all those challenges that that apple is going through, you know, in the course of a year, to go from blossom to fruit, to help make a commercial crop. When cider became, started to become an industry again, that cider really was produced from the dessert fruit that everybody was growing on a commercial scale. So, woodchuck and many of the cideries that came after it were primarily using, and to this day still are, primarily using what we call dessert fruit, Macintosh, Empire, Red Delicious, Honeycrisp, whatever it might be that you can buy, basically kind of riding the coattails of the commercial dessert fruit market. That's where all the apples are. And so a lot of product development continues to be done to make a complex or a unique or some kind of product that stands out among that. On the side, and some people think primarily, there's a whole other class of apples that people are looking at that are grown just to make cider. The economics are totally different around them because they can't ride on the coattails of bins of fruit that are going off to the grocery store for $30, $40, $60 a bushel. They have to capture all that cost in the cider bottle. So the economics are very different, but they do tend to add a very different flavor and complexity. And many of these varieties are European in origin, old European varieties, and some of the early kind of pioneering cider makers of the second wave, and even some of them were working during the first wave period, were going to Europe to find their varieties. Some people look around and say, we have apples all over the place, maybe we should look at these and see if they have that same kind of complexity. There's been some of that done. There's some cideries that are working on it. The trick is to scale up from that one tree you find in a hedgerow to the number of fruit that it takes to be commercially viable, at least on a larger scale. But there's been a few that are out there. Shaftesbury Cider Company has their Lost Apple project, and they have been selecting and propagating and planting out in orchards and evaluating different varieties. And then one from a grower up on the Canadian border, the Franklin cider apple. That one's gotten quite a bit of press, mainly because the person who discovered it really took it and kind of ran with it. So he got Stark Brothers Nursery, which is a well-renowned, nationally known nursery that is known for having broken Yellow Delicious and Red Delicious back in the 1800s. They started to collaborate with him to release this variety, and there's now 60, 70,000 trees out there in the U.S. Produced off this. We're just barely coming around to see some of those fruit bearing, or some of those trees bearing fruit. And it remains to be seen how that tree performs when it's not the same tree planted in the same location, within a stone's throw of the Canadian border. When people think I have this advanced system for testing juice, it's a really basic system that most people can do almost all of it on the tailgate of their truck. But we measure, sugar, pH, and acidity of all the apples of any research project, so we can see if there's any correlations we can make to potential cider quality. And when Franklin came through, there's a fourth characteristic that we measure, which is the one that you can't do on your tailgate because it requires an expensive piece of equipment. But it's a pretty simple, one number to put on a very complex thing, which is tannins or total phenolics. And when Franklin came through, I did one sample and it was off the charts higher for total tannins and phenolics than really anything I'd ever tested.
Hi, I'm Bill Mayo, and here is the Franklin cider tree up here in Franklin, Vermont on our property. Well, in the beginning, I was doing a lot of sweet cider. We own the Franklin General Store in Franklin, and what we were doing is we were using it as a blend because it had great dryness to it, I guess you'd call it. Later on, we call it astringency. And it just made a really, really nice blend in our sweet ciders. People loved it. And then we started doing like hard cider, experimenting with it and stuff like that. And I was looking at the raw component profiles after an analysis by Terry Bradshaw at UVM, which kind of like told me this is like something very special. So we started doing hard ciders with it. Well, I patent it first because it's unique and because you can, under plant patent laws in the US Patent Office, you can actually patent a plant. And I did it because one, I think I had a lot of possibilities, mostly for the cider industry. In order to really get it out there by patenting it and getting, we have 7 nurseries now that are licensed to sell this tree. It really afforded an opportunity for a lot of cider people now to be able to access and buy trees to grow to make a very fine hard cider. I entered the International Cider and Perry competition in 2017, and as a novice cider maker, I took a 3rd place bronze in the world competition. Eleanor Laguerre, she was I believe the vice president, if I'm saying that right, of the U.S. Cider Association, and she bought, for a couple of years, she's bought the Franklin cider and very pleased with the outcome of that. The feedback is excellent, so I think there's a lot of support right now for the Franklin cider apple.
So Eden Specialty Ciders started in the basement of our farmhouse in 2007 when we started producing ice cider. We had tasted that in Montreal a few months before and we're thinking, why is nobody making that in Vermont in any focused way, and thought we might just try to do it ourselves. We did that for a few years, then cider started becoming a thing in 2011, and then we realized we had formed relationships with growers with lots of interesting varieties of apples, and that we could also make some very interesting dry ciders. We expanded, we started making aperitifs, and then in 2012 we were thinking it's a little too big for our farmhouse basement, and we moved to this facility in Newport. So we planted 1,000 trees over 2008, 2009, 2010. It's holistically managed, so there's a group of people in the Northeast who are looking at how can we grow apples in a way that really encourages the trees to fend for themselves and respects the natural environment in the orchard, as opposed to killing lots of things to babysit the trees. We planted 55 varieties, lots of old New England and American heirlooms, some European culinary apple varieties, but also French and English bittersweet and bitter sharp varieties. And it's really been a long experiment to figure out which varieties are going to survive in our climate in Zone 3B with a holistic management program that, they really do have to figure out how to fight for themselves, and that actually will produce reliably every year with apples that actually taste good in cider. So out of the 55 at this point, there are about 15 that we really like. And so over the course of the past few years, we started top grafting some of the ones we like onto the ones that we don't like so much, as long as they were vigorous, and pulling some others out that weren't vigorous, and so forth.
This is actually a good, when we contrast this to the mother trees, you'll see the increased vigor that this inner stem concept does. It's imparting more vigor to the tree. Little concrete weights made in Dixie cups, then with a metal wire put in before the concrete dries, and then you would hang these before there's fruiting on a branch to help bring it back into a more horizontal position, to therefore increase flower bud production, because the way hormones flow in the tree depends on angles of the branch, and when they're too vertical they produce a lot of leaf, but when you bring them more down to a 60-degree angle they make more flower buds.
So ice cider is a pretty unique cider, right? It's a dessert wine, it's a specialty occasion kind of beverage. It goes very well on the dessert menu by the glass in a fancy restaurant. And so that's really where our market was. And so that led us pretty quickly outside of the state of Vermont to additional distribution in places like New York and Boston and DC, Chicago. And so most of the other ciders that we've developed since then have been focused on those customers.
Apples are, the cryoconcentration process of making ice cider is so different than picking grapes and pressing them immediately. With ice cider, we wait a long time to press the apples, and we press them, 30 to 60 days after harvest, and put them out to freeze for 4 weeks. And if you don't have the cold weather, things can go terribly wrong. It's extremely risky thing to do, to make ice cider.
We do have, actually, there are some barrels over here, 2012, 13, 14 ice ciders that are aging in barrel. And we've released a few that, 7 or 8 years in one barrel. And it is transformative in an amazing way. The sort of character of Pedro Jimenez or an Oloroso sherry, where you get sort of the fig and the raisin, apricot, walnuts. But the key also is that the varieties of apples that we're using in those are very high acid. So you don't get a cloyingly sweet experience. You get all of that richness balanced with this sort of core of acidity that really sets it off.
Making cider really depends on your goals. If you want a sparkling cider, picking something that has some tannin and sweetness is good. A lot of our ciders have a really big acid backbone, which is really important as well. But trying to get a higher alcohol percentage through having a sweeter apples is really important in kind of trying to balance out that acid and tannin in the cider.
The ice ciders are just like ice wine, so cold concentrated by our natural cold weather here in Vermont before fermentation, partially fermented, lots of residual sweetness, so very much a dessert-oriented cider. Champagne method, completely dry, right? But aged, secondary fermentation in the bottle, aged on the lees 18 months, hand disgorged, clean but unfiltered, unpasteurized, naturally sparkling, completely dry, lots of apple character. That's also equally amazingly special, but a completely different thing for cider than ice cider, or even a canned sweetened cider with fruit added, right? It's much more about dinner. So we're just launching 2 new cans because in this COVID world, cans are something that can definitely move. They're still made like wine in the sense that it's 1 batch a year pressed at harvest when they have all their flavor. One is totally dry, one has a little bit of residual sweetness, but they're nothing but apples, just 100% apple. No preservatives, just they're pasteurized. The driest one is unfiltered, hazy, tons of fruit character. It's got like peach, black tea, citrus notes to it. The off-dry one it's like applesauce and honey and wild white flowers, kind of rosy character to it. So they've got lots of flavor, but they're just apple. So we're in 20 states, East Coast, West Coast, Chicago, Denver, Kansas, Iowa. And then we've shipped some to the UK. We're actually starting up a relationship. I'm trying to get a pallet picked up to go to a boat right now. And South Korea and a little bit to Canada.
Scott Farm was first settled in 1791 by Rufus Scott, and eventually ownership passed to the Holbrook family, who in 1915 planted the orchards that still bears fruit today. In 95, Fred Holbrook gifted the Scott Farm to the Landmark Trust USA, a nonprofit whose mission is historic preservation. Of note, Rudyard Kipling lived just down the road.
Rudyard Kipling actually wrote the Jungle Book, like right here, a stone throw away from here, which is pretty remarkable. But shortly after I moved to Vermont with my wife, I accompanied my 4th grader to the Kipling house, where a storyteller told some just so stories, which was amazing, in Nolaka, in the Kipling house. So that's how I became acquainted with with the Nolaka property and the story of Rudyard Kipling living in Dummerston. I think he left a big impact. He didn't live here for many years, but he left a big impact. Yeah. Scott Farm was instrumental actually in 1911 was this orchard planted, and it was huge majority Macintosh, and Scott Farm was actually, as far as I know, the first farm in the country to ship apples in shipping crates. There was a patent that was developed at Scott Farm for apple shipping crates, and Scott Farm shipped apples all over the country. So that's the birth of these big commodity apple varieties, Macintosh for being the big one, and people really seeing and understanding apples as fresh eating apples.
In 2001, our previous orchard manager, orchardist Zeke Goodband, grafted most of the orchard into heirloom varieties, and we now grow over 130 varieties of heirloom apples. So most of these trees are on Macintosh or Cortland or Empire rootstock bases, and he topped them all and grafted them with scions he'd carried over the years to create this amazing, diverse orchard. And we are ecologically grown. It's just a magical place with a great history.
In the early 1900s, following, after the Prohibition, and after having known as a culture, having known apples as something you press and make cider, hard cider with, and alcohol, and in the early 1900s there was a considerable effort to change people's mind habits, consumer habits around how apples were consumed, and one of the big slogans at the time that really became popular, as we all know, is "An apple a day keeps the doctor away." That was part of that big marketing campaign.
The gentlemen that work for us during harvest are the heart and soul of this place. We would not be a working farm without them. They all come from Jamaica, different areas, Trelawney, Clarendon, St. Elizabeth, Kingston, and they work 7 days a week, all day long. They know the fruit like the back of their hands. They know this whole orchard better than anybody, I would say, and when to pick and how to pick it. And they're just beautiful people. They care for the fruit. They know how to be gentle with it and to pack it properly. They will go through and pick the apples and then grade them, and the old adage or term is 50% red, 2.5 inches, no bruises. So even when they dump the fruit out into the bins, they do it very gently because the fruit bruises very easily, of course. And then they will grade the fruit so that they are, larger than 2.5 inches, 50% red. If there's any inconsistency in the growth pattern, then they become seconds, which we often use for cider, for our sweet cider, or sending out to different cideries like Eden or Stowe, or to do their hard cider making.
My wife Gail and I purchased the mill in January of 2000, so it's been 20 years now that we've owned the cider mill. I was in the ski industry. The ski industry was fun for about 100 days out of the year, but then after the rest of the year was kind of a drag. So we like living in this part of Vermont, and we decided to look around for a business that was for sale, and I've actually found quite a few businesses for sale, but this one was the most interesting. Had a lot of moving parts, which is right up my alley, and seemed like a lot of fun.
Everybody would always come here for the fresh cider that we make on an old-fashioned rack and cloth press, and everybody loves the cider donuts, and the locals always want to make sure they're hot, and we do every possible method to make sure that everyone's getting hot donuts when they want them.
The bakery, which has been in place since we bought the mill, with some homemade by scratch apple pies and other bakery goodies. So those things have remained consistent, so the people that come to visit us can basically expect that a lot of the staples that they have come to know and expect from the mill are still there, along with some new offerings.
This piece is dated back to the 40s, some parts actually the 20s. We're one of, I believe, only 2 cloth and rack piston systems in the United States that are still operating. The apples come from orchards in eastern New York and Vermont. They're trucked in on tractor trailers, generally 52 bins to a truck. Each bin is 20 bushel or approximately 800 pounds. And then they are stored in a very large cooler that we have here on the premises and dumped into a big bin just outside of where we're sitting here. And they go into a conveyor belt, which brings them through a washer, so they're all scrubbed. The washer also separates the bad fruit from the good, brings it to another conveyor belt that goes up to the masher, which pulverizes the apple into a mash that's fed through a pump and hose into the cloth and racks that you see here behind us. Well, the press operates with one solid piston that you can probably see right behind me. We have one up pressed right now. We go through 14 layers. Each layer consists of about 150 to 200 pounds of pumice. And it's moved under the main piston. Then the pumps are turned on. The piston rises and it gets to a pressure of about 1,800 pounds and squeezes all the juice out into these containers that you can see it dripping into, which then is pumped into large holding tanks.
And now the most recent addition of a lot of hard cideries have been taking our cider to make hard cider. And the beauty of that is that they don't care when they get the cider. They'll take it any time of year. So it really is great because we are able to make cider all year round and not lay off any of our staff as we used to do in the past. We launched our whole hard cider program, expanded it to 10 taste profiles, and didn't invest $1 in infrastructure or expertise. That's out there. And everybody's got capacity, everybody's willing to help. It's a very sharing environment.
Boyden Valley Winery will make our hard cider. They primarily make Barn Dance. Or Mark Simikaski over at Artisano in Groton. He makes our smaller batches. He's a producer of mead, honey wine.
We've had a great relationship with Cold Hollow in that they are very good at making juice, and we do a pretty good job at making cider, hard cider, out of that juice. So the process today is we got in a blend of apples that Cold Hollow just pressed within the last day or two, and they came into the tanks, and as you can see, they're little. The tanks are still sweating, so it's pretty cold cider. Within another couple days, once this warms up to the right temperature, we'll start the fermentation and start converting those sugars to alcohol. Once it's at the right temperature, we'll add a yeast to it, and that'll get the fermentation going. And that'll ferment probably for on the order of about 2 weeks. After that, we let gravity do its thing and let a lot of those heavier particles settle out. Once those particles are settled out and the hard cider becomes clear, then we prep it for bottling. It'll either get shipped out of here in bulk for canning at Stowe Cider, or we'll put it in kegs for Cold Hollow to serve at their tasting room at their facilities.
Stowe Cider, they make they make several hard ciders, and they will use our fresh cider to make their hard cider. And we also partner with them with regards to canning our hard cider.
Yeah, so Stowe Cider's been around for 7 years. We started out on Route 100 in a small deli just outside of Stowe, making just small batch dry ciders, available only in keg, expanded out to some larger format 22-ounce bottles back when those were popular. And then in about 2015, we launched our cans, and since then we've expanded our distribution, but continuing to keep our cider dry and our apples locally sourced. I started making cider because I wasn't any good at making beer. To be perfectly honest, it was a new thing for me and for a lot of people about 10 years ago. And now it's kind of creeping up everywhere. I found myself to be a bit more of a chef than a baker. And by that, I mean with the ability to ferment fruit and play with different ingredients when you're making cider and fermenting fruit, you have a little bit more flexibility. It needs a little bit more of this fruit. It needs a little bit more of that. Whereas when you're making beer, it requires rule following, which I was never that good at. You have to follow your times, your temperatures, and everything is very specific. Your build out and your bill for making beer and brewing beer is very much like baking. If you're off just a little bit, your product is going to be probably not very good. But when you're making wines and ciders, it's all about kind of tasting. Is it ready? It needs another day or another month in the barrel. And that's what I really love about making and fermenting fruit and making wines and ciders. We try to maintain a specific type of blend of apples to get a sugar content, which dictates our alcohol level. That's what the yeast does. It ferments the sugar, creates CO2 and alcohol. So we want a consistent sugar content, and then we also want a consistent acidity level. That's what gives it that nice tart bite that we're known for, makes it really crisp, and also keeps the shelf stability by keeping your pH low. And so we're working with many different orchards in order to maintain that blend of apples. When we look at some of our specialty ciders in limited release, we look to some of the more specialty fruit, cider-specific apples that we can source from orchards like Scott Farm down in southern Vermont, and they're known for cultivating and growing a lot of cider-specific fruits like Newtown Pippin, Kingston Black, Ashmead Kernel, and so you'll find those in our Vermont Grown series and some of the limited release items and even some of our single varietal barrel-aged products. We've got our headliners, which are the ciders we make all year. We've got our rotating tracks, which are our version of seasonal ciders. And then today we're working on a special project, one that's near and dear to me. It's part of our Vermont Grown series. It focuses on ingredients that are grown right here in Vermont. And this one is featuring two fruits, something we may call Jam Session. I don't know, we'll find out here shortly when we've had a few samples. But it's featuring damson plums from Scott Farm Orchard and black currants from Lanzer's Fruit Farm up in Hardwick. And so those two fruits combined are going to be a very jammy type product, which is going to be dry. And with a name like Jam Session, it will likely be a little bit more sessionable, under 6% alcohol. So pretty excited about that. It comes from a series of ciders we've done. Behind that, we've got a blueberry maple, we've got a raspberry basil honey. We've done our single orchard blend, which was with Scott Farm as well, using 16 different varietals of cider and heirloom varietal fruits. And then beyond that, we'll see what kind of comes up next. But the Vermont Grown series is certainly something special and features the great fruit grown here in Vermont. We have a little program that we call internally From Waste to Taste, and we work on focusing our ciders and taking ingredients that would otherwise go to waste, and we turn those and we add them to the barrels. So we're using some maple soaked vanilla and cinnamon, and we put that in the barrel, the maple barrel. So we take that waste and we turn it to taste. Mad River Taste Place is one of our favorite shops, if not the favorite, for Vermont meats and cheese. They are a proud supporter for the Vermont cider industry, and they carry, I think, just about every one of our products, and I know just about every one of all the other Vermont cider producers. So.
Well, I'd like to see the future blasting off.
I think there's just a ton of room to grow in terms of distributing cider throughout the state.
As for each cider company and what we do well and kind of where our brand lies, and that's what I think And that's why I think Vermont cider is going to be sustainable.
It's amazing how you can go to a grocery store, to a little convenience store, to a little mom and pop store all over the state and see a whole cider section.
You know, Vermont has become known for craft cideries as well, always known as for craft beer.
But because we're in New England and people know what apple trees are and they understand going to the orchard and picking an apple, I think cider has such a strong hold.
I think the future is really bright for cider. We have so much room to grow.
There's a great opportunity for Vermont cideries to tell the story about Vermont cider outside of the state of Vermont.
Adam and Eve could have turned it into cider, let the cider ferment, raise a toast to the host, adios and amen. Hard cider, easy living, drinking apple a day keeps the doctor away, keeps the tick-tock ticker ticking, keeps the tick-tock ticker ticking, keeps the tick-tock ticker ticking. Hard cider, easy living, drinking apple a day keeps the doctor away, keeps the tick-tock ticker ticking, keeps the tick-tock ticker ticking, keeps the tick-tock ticker ticking.
Vermont PBS, partnering with local filmmakers to bring you stories made here. For more, visit vermontpbs.org.